Let's go traveling with Paul once again. Remember, he was warned several times, and specifically by Agabus through the Holy Spirit, not to go to Rome. But of course, he went because it was the will of God. What he was warned about would be the sufferings that would await him there. And last week we looked at his arrest and the various trials where he defended himself before Romans and Jews as well. And now he's off to Rome because he has made an appeal. He has a right to do that as a Roman citizen, to go all the way to the emperor. So let's see if we can get him there today. His journey to Rome. This is the seventh in our series of studies traveling with Paul. And Luke writes, and when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. You see below it right, a centurion's military regalia, armor. Now, Julius, as a centurion, would have commanded 100 men, century 100. He belonged to the Augustan cohort, according to what Luke has recorded. A cohort had 600 men. Now, that would mean that in this cohort, as in any cohort, there would be 6 centurions, and he was one of them. And Luke adds that he was of the Augustan cohort. Suggestion from that would be that he was a member of the imperial bodyguard. Remember, the emperor at this time was Nero. But what Luke will emphasize is how well Julius treated Paul. And we have seen that throughout our study and continue to see it, that Paul was well treated by the Romans. That is due to the fact that beyond the city of Rome itself, at this time, there was order and discipline, and Roman laws were enforced. It was only in the capital that strange, insane emperors such as Gaius or Caligula or Nero would cause a problem. At least at this time, out of the provinces, things are going well, and Paul is a Roman citizen. He is treated with the respect of a Roman citizen. Now, further, the fact that he is not only a member of the Augustan cohort, but his name is Julius. He could well be from the Julian clan, and that would mean he was, in fact, related to the imperial family. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. That's Acts 27:2. A couple of things to notice from this verse. Adramyttium, you see on the map here, it is located not far from Caesarea. That's where he starts. And it's interesting, he didn't go by land. You could go by land to the port at Sidon. Adramyttium is where he departed in this case. But he chose to go by ship along the coast. Ships that sailed near the coast were smaller vessels than those out in the Mediterranean Sea in the open. They were not suited for inclement weather. They were for transporting goods along the coast from city to city. So that is his first ship. We'll see that he's going to go on 3 of them by the time he gets to Rome. But also Luke specifically mentions that he was accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. So I think we need to look at Aristarchus for a moment. Understanding Paul is also understanding his friends and his companions who went with him and were so close to him and so much committed to the gospel. Aristarchus his name comes from 2 Greek words. Aristos means best. Archos means ruler, so best ruler. We don't know that he was in fact a ruler. That's just his given name. He was a Thessalonian Christian who was a close companion of Paul. And there are several references in the New Testament, probably all of them referring to the same man. I take a quote now from the Bible Gateway source. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, first appeared as Paul's companion during the riot at Ephesus. As Paul's companions in travel, he and Gaius were seized by the mob and rushed into the theater, but seemed to have been released unharmed. He and Secundus apparently were the official delegates from the Thessalonian church, accompanying Paul to Jerusalem with the collection. Aristarchus was present when Paul's ship left Caesarea on the trip to Rome, and that's what we have just noticed. A scholar named Ramsey contended that he could only have accompanied Paul as his slave. It's not certain, however, that he went all the way to Rome with Paul. He may have been going home and stopped off at Myra, as Lightfoot suggested. But he was with Paul in Rome when he wrote Colossians and Philemon. In Philemon, he is designated as a fellow worker, but in Colossians, he's called my fellow prisoner, a title also given Epaphras. Perhaps the two alternated in voluntary sharing of Paul's imprisonment. From the grouping of the names in Colossians, Aristarchus seems to be of Jewish origin. And according to tradition, he was martyred in Rome under Nero. One comment I would have on this quote, I don't agree that he would have been Paul's slave necessarily. Don't think Paul would be interested in having a slave. And again, from the fact that throughout Paul's arrest, imprisonment, he is always allowed to have friends come to him. And I think the way that he was being treated by Julius here, I think that we may conclude that he was simply a friend of Paul's, allowed to go with him. So leaving from Caesarea and going to Adramyttium, and then the next day, Luke says, we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and to be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. Now, here is where they change ships. This will be the second of 3 ships that Paul will employ in going to Rome, obviously because this ship is going to be equipped to go out in the open sea. Ships from Alexandria were excellent vessels. Alexandria was noted for that. So let's look at this map. Now, this is a long journey, and it's the journey from Caesarea in Palestine and all the way to Rome. And so you can see the first journey, Caesarea, Adramyttium doesn't show up here, to Sidon, and then going across close to hugging the coast and going to Myra, and then going past Lycia into Cnidus, and we'll continue from there. As they sailed under the lee, that means they sailed at Cyprus so as to avoid the wind. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, as the wind did not allow us to go farther. We sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone, coasting along with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens, which was near the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Now we have a hint as to the time of year, because Luke mentions that the fast was over. That is the fast connected with the Day of Atonement. That would be near the end of September. And so winter is coming on, and we can see already that the weather is not favorable for sailing. The wind is not helpful at all. And also that in this case, Julius listened more to the pilot than to what Paul said, and consequently they're going to find themselves in some difficulty. So again, you can see as we trace the journey, Nidus, you see Nidus, and then coming down to the south part of Crete because of the wind, to Lasea, and trying to reach Phoenix, but they did not get there. Now, this is a close-up map. This is taken from the internet, put out by a Christian pastor. And you can see perhaps a little more accurately how they coming from the right. You see Salmone, and then going down south of Crete under the lee to head off toward hopefully Phoenix, but they're not going to go there. They're driven by the wind south of Cauda. Now, at Crete, though Paul doesn't go on shore and visit the island, I'll just make a little comment, a little digression here to talk about Crete. Now, Paul has been in Europe before. We've seen him in Macedonia, where he visited Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea. We've seen him in Achaia, where he visited first Athens and then Corinth. So he's been in Europe. This is the first time that he will be in the western area, and the first time that he's going to encounter Crete, which happens to be the first European civilization. Now, I'd like to make just a comment about civilization for a moment. Now, here's the island of Crete, and you can see the capital city is the north part, Knossos up there, but they are sailing the south part of the island. And then the note here, the island of Crete, Minoans, that's what the Cretans were known as. That comes from mythology, King Minos and the Minotaur, if you remember that story. So they were called Minoans. And they were not Greeks. Greeks came later, but the Greeks learned their civilization from them. The point I'd like us to understand is that civilization is a learned thing. It is not something that is self-generated spontaneously. People learn the techniques of living, of trade, of taking care of themselves, medicine, language, education, and so forth. All of the characteristics of civilization they will learn from other civilizations. And so we go back in time. And as we go back in time, there are going to be fewer and fewer early civilizations until we come to the first civilization. Now, the Minoan society, Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, came about, this suggests 2200, anywhere from 2200, perhaps 2500. Please notice the language of the Cretans. There are two types of language that's been determined from just studying them. And the gentleman named Sir Arthur Evans was the first person really to look into and excavate in Crete. He's a British scholar. There were two types of languages, and one of them he named Linear A. That language has been deciphered by its similarity to the Greek letters. It's not Greek, but it can be transposed over into Greek letters, and from there the comparison to Greek can be made. However, that was Linear B. Linear A has never been deciphered. It is still unknown, and some of the mysteries of the Minoan civilization are dependent upon Linear A being deciphered. Now, here are the civilizations. You see where Crete is. It is the fifth in the order of early civilizations. You see the first 5 civilizations in the world. The first civilization was Sumer. That's in the area of the Garden of Eden. The capital of Sumer was Ur. Abraham came from Ur. And the second and third and fourth, the next 3 in order, came about 500 years after Sumer. Most scholars date Sumer beginning at 3500 and being destroyed around 1900 BC, and that Egypt, China, and India, the next 3, are going to come about 500 years later. Some scholars will date beginning of Sumer as early as 4500. Now, these three, Egypt, India, and China, are going to be come about and get their characteristics of civilization from Sumer. There's no doubt about that by comparing certain attributes. Now, from which of these first four did Crete get civilization? Did they learn it? Probably not China or India. There are some characteristics similar to Egypt, similar to Sumer, but again, until linear A is deciphered, one would not know for sure. But the fact is they learned it from somebody, these Minoan people, whoever they were, who appeared around 2500. And they're the ones who are going to provide the basis for the civilization of Greece, and they in turn for Rome. So the Greco-Roman civilizations, which of course influenced all of Europe, will go back to the Minoans and eventually back to Sumer. Well, let's go back to Luke now and his comments. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, please note at the bottom, the Syrtis is the name of two large sandbanks off the coast of Libya. So that's what they're concerned about, running aground there. They lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. I'm sure you notice that Luke, of course, he is inspired by the Holy Spirit, but he also gives evidence here of considerable knowledge of navigation by ship. Well, since they had been without food or for a long time, Paul stood among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me, and not have set sail from Crete, incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship, and he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island.' When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. That's about 120 feet, because a fathom is around 6 feet, 1.8 meters. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms, about 90 feet. And fearing that we might run aground, run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, 'Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved.' Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go." A couple of things to note here. Paul earlier had said there will be loss of life, but that's before an angel of God spoke to him and told him that that would not be the case, rather that all would be saved. No one's life would be lost. That is something that Paul comes to learn, and he passes it on to these sailors who are about to escape, but he warns them, unless you stay on this ship, you cannot be saved. Now, let's stop for a theological inference here, something significant. God told Paul through the angel No one is going to lose his life, not any of them. And by the way, did you notice as we were reading that Paul was talking to these sailors who were not Jews and who did not know about the true God? And you have certainly a picture of how Paul dealt with people who were not Jews. We talked about last week about the fact that when he presents the gospel to Jews, he reasons with them on the basis of Scripture. And here he simply says, the God whom I serve, and I know that he is true. So the message to these people is, the sailors, no one's going to die, but you have to stay on the ship. Question: how can God be sovereign and man responsible? And what about the warnings? Let's look at the Westminster Confession of Faith, which sums up a number of scriptures. God did from all eternity, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass, so that thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. In other words, as Paul said in Ephesians, God works everything according to the counsel of his own will. Now, then how is it that these men decided to stay? Because they were thinking about jumping off the ship. And Paul says, no one can do that and be saved. You have to stay on the ship for everybody to be saved. So what is natural for these people to do is make a run for it, to get off. The ship is going to sink in this wind, this tempestuous wind. The question is, and the answer is, is man's will, his desire, his choice. The natural inclination is to jump off the ship, but they must stay on the ship. What about the will? And for this, let's go to the last part of that first question from the Heidelberg Catechism. Therefore, by his Holy Spirit, he also assures me of eternal life and makes me heartily willing and ready from now on to live for him. And back to the Westminster, which you read above, God ordains of his own will everything that comes to pass, but as that God is not the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures. Man still has a will, but God works in that will. And I think the answer to the question is going to be that God worked in the will of these men to listen to Paul and to stay on the ship. Now, if you want a Bible verse that sums this up very clearly, Philippians 2, Paul writing these verses, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Now, for many years, I was taught to quote that verse and to stop there. And that leaves people with the understanding it's all up to you. You work out your salvation. Whether you're going to be saved or not depends on your works, on what you do. Work it out with fear and trembling. But I stopped. And I'm not going to stop today, because if you go to verse 13, Paul went on to say, explaining, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. How can God be sovereign and man responsible? God is totally sovereign and man is totally responsible, and the warnings mean exactly what they say. And yet God works within the heart and the mind of his people, so that, as the psalmist said, your troops are willing in the day of battle. Let's go back to Luke's narrative now. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, men, it's now the 14th day that you've continued in suspense without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We, Luke being among them, we were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then, hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. The counsel of God, the plan of God, Paul believing it, and now the centurion believing it as well. And everybody safely gets to land. And where did they land? The island of Malta. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out and because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man's a murderer. Though he's escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Here's the island of Malta. The language there, I really don't know what it is. I think it might be Arabic. You could tell me. It was the best map I could find. I'm sorry that it's not in a language that we know. But anyway, there's the shape of the island of Malta. Now, in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. Once again, Paul finds people who honor him and respect him. Now, Publius, the epithet hoprotos, the chief man, as it's translated here, has been confirmed by 2 Maltese inscriptions as an official title. So that is this man Publius's official title. He apparently was a chief Roman official on Malta. Now, tradition points to Publius as the first bishop of Malta and a martyr after his conversion. Now, perhaps news had spread of the viper that bit Paul, and that was the reason that Publius was so receptive. Publius showed great hospitality to Paul and to his company, which of course included Luke, and he healed Publius's father and others. He probably was indeed, Publius, you can see, a Roman. After 3 months, and during that 3 months, I should imagine Paul was busy preaching the gospel. Luke doesn't detail it. So after 3 months, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria, with the twin gods Castor and Pollux as a figurehead. Putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. Now we have the third and final ship that Paul will use in reaching Italy. It was customary at that time, at the front of the ship, bow of the ship, there would be these figures for good luck. Obviously here, the gods Castor and Pollux, the twin gods. And again, a ship from Alexandria, an excellent ship, I'm sure. And they will sail from Malta to Sicily. This is the emblem of Sicily, rather strange emblem, but you see why. If you look at the map of Sicily, it looks very much like those 3 legs on that creature that symbolizes the island of Sicily. Sicily is a civilization of itself, a part of Italy today. Now, the arrow at the right points to Syracuse, Syracusa, and that's where they went. That's really all that Paul will be involved with on Sicily at this time. Interesting. The island of Sicily has been controlled or in some way influenced by 14 different peoples, different groups of people. The original people were Sicans, and Elymians. Then came the Greeks, the Athenians, and then the Spartans, also the Carthaginians, and then the Romans. I stopped the list with the Romans, but there were many others after that, such as Germans and Spanish and Muslims, to make a total of 14 different people, class that was supposed to be on world civilization. But the way I did it was to start with Sicily. We're going to study Sicily. And then as we came to each of these 14 groups, we simply looked at them and gave the story of them. Now, in Syracuse, the very city that Paul visited, there's a temple to Athena, which is still, as you can see from this picture, still standing. So I would imagine that we can conclude that while Paul was there, he may have seen this Athena temple. There were 3 temples to Athena built to commemorate a battle. That is the victory of the Greeks over the Carthaginians at Himera in 480 BC. It was during the time that the Carthaginians and the Persians were working together in concerted effort to try to destroy the Greeks. The Greeks defeated both the Carthaginians here, and traditionally on the same day, they will defeat the Greeks. Now, this is the interior of this church or temple, a temple now that is a church, showing the Doric columns. Those are the original columns of that Greek temple. And from there, says Luke, we made a circuit and arrived at Rhegium Calabria. That's the very tip of the toe of Italy, as you can see there. On this map, I'm pointing in the arrow, the one on the bottom, to Syracuse, and then moving up to the north, you see where Regia is. There's a small body of water that separates Sicily, which is an island, from Italy, which is a peninsula. Remember, when I was studying Latin, we translated Italia, peninsula est, and Sicily, no, it's not a peninsula known as peninsula est, island. I remember that we crossed that 2 times, actually, by train, which seems strange. We took a train down to Regia, and then the train is split into different sections on a ferry boat and ferried across, and then it's put back together at Messina, and then it's reversed when you go back to Italy. Well, after a day, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day, we came to Puteoli, that is Pozzuoli today. There we found brothers. Well, did that mean a church? Well, I think it might. We found brothers and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. Once again, hospitality was extended to Paul and his company. Puteoli's importance owed to the security of its harbor and the lack of any decent harbors closer to Rome. However, by the time of Paul, there was another harbor constructed much closer to Rome, that at Ostia. So this was not any official harbor at this time. That was constructed by the Emperor Claudius. Ostia today still has a number of buildings from ancient Roman times still standing. So Puteoli was the main harbor for the city of Rome until Claudius built Ostia. And Rome is about 170 miles away from Puteoli. Here is the harbor, which is where Paul would have put in. He would have been there. And he would have at last arrived in Italy. This is the Roman Forum in Puteoli. Now you'll see where obviously a temple or some structure stood, but another picture, we move around to the other side, this is a picture that I took myself. you can see this structure in the center of the forum. That is the Serapion. Serapis was an artificial composite god that was put together by the Romans because there were so many different gods being worshipped to try to give some unity to their religion. And so these Serapia were built at various places throughout the Roman Empire. This is the Serapion for the worship of Serapis at Puteoli. Now let's go to a map. At last, Paul has arrived on Italy and the peninsula of Italy. Remember that we talked about the Via Egnatia, which began at Byzantium, which became Constantinople, which is Istanbul today, and then went across the Baltic Peninsula until reaching what is now Croatia, then Dalmatia, and then travelers would be ferried across to Brundisium, which is today Brindisi. You see there two highways, obviously an extension of the Via Egnatia, and then the Via Appia in the white. But Paul is going to be landing here at Pozzuoli. You see where the arrow is. And at that point, he would transfer over to the highway and go on the Appian Way into Rome. So we came to Rome, and that along the Appian Way. The first of the Roman highways to be built, and it was built by the censor Appius Claudius in 312 BC. Censors served, there were two of them that served 5-year terms, and they were elected. Censors had the responsibility for maintaining public works, such as roads, and this is the first one. Can you imagine a highway today lasting for 2,300 years? Censors also were responsible for public morals, hence our word censorship. They were also responsible for maintaining the record of citizenship, and we get our word census from that. Now, the Appian Way connected the Forum in Rome, that's its terminal point, with the port city of Brundisium, Brindisi. After the Roman conquest of the East opened up trade routes, these highways were used to transport trade. They were used for military purposes, for soldiers to travel on as they will conquer the empire. Of course, also used to enable evangelists to take the gospel in different places. So parts of the Appian Way, as you can see here, are still extant and usable today. Some parts we find vehicles going over them. Now, one reason that this road lasted for 2,300 years, and Roman roads were built to last, is that they would dig this trench about 30 feet deep and then deposit layers of different stones. And you see from the diagram that large stones first, smaller stones, you can see the Latin names for them, still smaller stones, and then the paving stones on the very top. So that helps you understand how these roads could last so long. Now here's a picture. This is one of my pictures of the Appian Way. Alice and I would often walk on the Appian Way to see the very interesting and very significantly historical places along the Appian Way. And you see the ruts that are carved there by many, many chariots going over it. Another picture of the Appian Way, the original stones. And so back to Luke's narrative, and the brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. Of course, there were Christians there. We do not know just how they became Christians, who were responsible, because this is going to be Paul's first time being there. And even when he earlier wrote the letter to the Romans from Corinth, there were Christians there. There was a church there. Now, in regard to the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns is a town about 33 miles from Rome, where several roads come together, the main road being the Appian Way. Intersections exist with roads leading to Tusculum, Alba Longa, which was the original Roman settlement, and to Antium. As a result, this was a frequent meeting place for travelers. The name seems to have been derived from the presence of three shops, as opposed to three inns: a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a tavern. One party awaited him at three taverns, while another proceeded as far as Appian Forum. Today, it consists only of ruins near Treponte in Italy, 2 miles from the northwest end of the ancient canal where the mules and their drivers rested 37 miles southeast of Rome. And here in a close-up map, you can see where three taverns is identified. And just to the south of that, the Forum of Appius. So we have one group of Christians going as far as three taverns, another group going all the way to the Forum of Appius, there to meet Paul and his party and escort them on into Rome. Now, Paul at last gets to Rome, as God had promised that he would. And he saw some things as he entered the Appian Way. For instance, he would have seen the famous tomb of Cecilia Metella, by far the largest and most imposing, and very, very ancient. I assure you, it was there when Paul saw it, and he would have gone right by it, so he couldn't have missed it. And there's also a collage of tombs and family sculptures that are scattered along the Appian Way, along with many other significant Roman places. Romans buried their dead outside the walls. They could never bury them inside a city wall. So you can see how they're outside on the Appian Way, and they honored their dead. They would put statues or even inscriptions, sculptures of them here, sculptures of a family. When they cross their arms like that over their chests, it's indicating that they are dead. But they wanted to keep the family together, very family-oriented people. Here's a close-up. And also, the Roman sculptures are very realistic. They were not idealistic. Here, in this particular tomb, we see not only the sculptures, but you see the names of the people who are interred there. Now, as Paul entered the city of Rome, he would have entered through the Porta Capena, which is a gate in the Servian wall in Rome. The gate was located in the area of the Piazza di Porta Capena, where the Caelian, Palatine, and Aventine hills meet. You know, there are 7 hills in Rome. 3 of those hills come together at this point. The original walls of Rome were the Servian walls built in the 4th century BC, so Paul would have seen those walls. The later walls, which still stand in Rome, are the Aurelian wall, built in the 3rd century AD, long after Paul's time. In this map, I've tried to locate for you where Paul would have entered the city of Rome. The bottom arrow will identify, I really believe to be the Appian Way. You see several roads coming in there, and I think this is the Appian Way. But you see they converge at the point of the upper arrow, and that is where the Porta Capena is. You see it mentioned there, just above. And thus Paul would have entered into the city. The black line in the center would indicate the old Servian walls, and the outer circle would be the present Aurelian wall. And then came the eventful meeting of Paul with the Jews in Rome, the first time that there will be a concerted effort to bring the gospel to the Jewish people in Rome and by the Apostle Paul. Luke says, after 3 days, he called together the local leaders of the Jews. And when they had gathered, he said to them, brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. When they had examined me, they wished to set me at liberty because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case. But because the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, though I had no charge to bring against my nation. For this reason, therefore, I've asked to see you and to speak with you, since it is because of the hope of Israel that I'm wearing this chain. And they said to him, we have received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken any evil about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are with regard to this sect, we know that it is everywhere spoken against. And next week, we shall continue our study as we see Paul in the city of Rome, and we're going to try to determine what Paul would have seen in the city of Rome.